Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the New World in our continuing study of the history of civilization. Christopher Columbus is the name that first comes to mind when we talk about the discovery of the Americas. And of course, remember that they had already been discovered. There were people living there. They had discovered them hundreds and thousands of years earlier, but they had not gone back to Europe to write about it. And so for that, we have to give Columbus the credit. He was an Italian sailor. Now, there was no country of Italy. Italy was divided up into a number of small city-states. But he was from the area known as Italy, and he was sponsored by Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile, both from the Spanish peninsula. But there was no country of Spain. And so you have these two countries, Aragon and Castile, and they had been joined together. The king of Aragon and the queen of Castile had married, and it had become a great alliance, although they continued to be two separate countries. And together they had driven out the Muslims from Granada, and the Muslims had now been expelled. And it was only when this took place in 1492, it was completed, that now they could sponsor the trip of Columbus. Columbus came to them looking for sponsorship for a western route to China and to the Indies. Um, and he theorized, of course, everybody knew the world was round. There was some discussion about how far it was to China, and Columbus had seriously um, um, underestimated how far it was to the west. He didn't realize there was an entire continent in the way, or the Atlantic or the Pacific. He did not realize how big that ocean was. And it's fortunate for him that he was wrong, because as it turned out, if he had tried to make that same journey without the Americas being there, then it's likely he never would have completed the trip. So he sought a western route, and he was granted three ships paid for by those two countries, by Ferdinand and Isabella. The Santa Maria was about 60 feet long. That was his flagship, captained by Columbus. Now remember that the Chinese 100 years earlier had ships, where a flagship was 450 feet long. This would qualify as a large rowboat to those earlier Chinese explorers, and yet it's going to do the trick. And the Nina and the Pinta are even smaller; they're about 50 feet long. And with these three tiny ships, he will make the voyage. He sailed initially to the Canary Islands. The location of these were known, and Columbus was a good navigator, a good sailor, very very capable. He sailed from there. They went west for 5 weeks, and he was actually lying to his fellow sailors about how far they had gone. He was underestimating it in the official logs, and yet he was keeping private logs because he understood how far they were going, and he was afraid they would insist on turning back. No, we've come far too far. They landed in the Bahamas October 12th, 1492. And remember, that's right in the middle of hurricane season. So weather-wise, Columbus was very fortunate. He ran into natives that were there from the Americas, from the mainland, and he immediately noticed that they were wearing, at least some of them were wearing, gold ornaments. And it's been often said that the explorers went for three reasons. They went for glory, and I think Columbus was after the glory. They went for God, and Columbus in his notes talks about how he's going to try to bring these people to know the Lord. But the third G, they went for glory, they went for God, they also went for gold. And when he saw the gold, I think that took a greater part of his attention. And so he claimed not just the place where they had set. He called that San Salvador, but they also continued to sail around the surrounding islands, discovering Cuba and the area that he named Hispaniola. Today we know it as two separate countries, Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And he claimed these for Spain. The As I said, he sailed around a number of the islands of the Bahamas and Cuba and Hispaniola. At one point, his flagship, the Santa Maria, ran aground and had to be scuttled. And then two of the two other ships, one of them sort of sailed away and did their own thing. And so um, Columbus finally made it back and rejoined with the missing ship. They finally got back together and returned home to report what they had found. Now, Columbus felt that he had found some of the islands that were off the coast of China, the Indies. He was describing them in those sorts of terms, and he was now given a much larger fleet, something like 20 ships, to return, and he would make 4 voyages. At one point, he would become a governor, and because of his, as good as he was at being a sailor, he made a not so good governor, and at one point he was actually imprisoned and sent back to Spain in disgrace, but he was released, and so he was given some honor, and certainly he is deserving of that as far as his voyages are concerned. Columbus tells one story about how he had been stranded for a time in Cuba, and the natives were getting restless and rather angry at him. But Columbus was not only something of a explorer and navigator, he knew quite a bit about astronomy, and he was able to predict a an upcoming lunar eclipse. And he told the natives, "Look, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to make the moon disappear." And sure enough, the moon disappeared that night, and they thought, "Oh my goodness, he's got this great power." And of course, the power that he had was a knowledge of astronomy. It was left to Amerigo Vespucci, and this is why we call the America, we call the North and South America instead of North and South Columbus. It was left to Amerigo Vespucci to theorize that an entire continent had been found. Now, they didn't know the size of that continent. Notice on the map over here on the left how small are the Americas. They didn't know how far it extended, but they got a sense that there were a landmass from the north to the very south, and they had begun to pick up on the shape of those lands. Meanwhile, voyages continued to the east. Vasco da Gama was the one who actually made it around the Cape of Good Hope. That had already been done earlier by Diaz, but now he made it all the way to India and back. And this is, remember, where Columbus was seeking to go. He was beat out by da Gama, who actually arrived in India long. Well, Columbus never did arrive there. We also have to make mention of Cabral, who, following that same route, um, was blown off course. Sometimes you're going in one direction and you run into something along the way, and he ran into South America, the area that we know now as Brazil. And that's going to be the reason why you go to South America and you have Spanish spoken in almost every country except that far eastern area. That far eastern area where they speak Portuguese, and this was going to be a result of several treaties as well as a an edict by Pope Alexander, who will divide between Spain and Portugal that new world, and most of it would go to Spain, and a small section of it would go to Portugal because of that discovery. Now, finally, we have to talk about the Columbian Exchange. Not that Columbus was doing this, but as a result of his voyage and the discoveries that came after that, you began having certain foods that had been developed in the Americas, like corn and potatoes and beans and peanuts and pumpkins and tomatoes and pineapples and yes, my bane, chocolate, as well as tobacco. They all began to make their way by these traders back to the European and African and Asian continents. So um, those were ready sources of food. In fact, you talk about the Irish potato, but it didn't start in Ireland. It started in the Americas. We don't call it the American potato, although perhaps we ought to. And then there were certain things that had never made it to the Americas that only now made their way across the ships. Large animals like goats and sheep and chickens and horses, they had never made it to the Americas. Also pigs, I'm not sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing, but they were sent over as well. Um, as well as bananas and wheat, but also some diseases. Actually, diseases went in both directions. Syphilis came from the Americas to Europe, but some other much more potent diseases, smallpox and measles and typhus, would come and devastate the American population. Now, those diseases had in the past devastated European and African populations, but now they would come and within a fairly short time would bring destruction to the Americas. So that by the time we get to 1580, this is almost 100 years after Columbus, notice in red we have the areas occupied by Spain, and we'll look and see next time how that took place. But then notice in blue we have those areas occupied by Brazil, and the rest of Europe at this point was sort of a non-entity when it came to those colonies and possessions. It was a Spanish/Portuguese world in 1580.